The roar of jet engines echoed like thunder across the tarmac at LAX, heat waves rising from the asphalt as if the air itself was tense. Gate C-18 bustled with the familiar chaos, heels clicking on linoleum, overhead announcements blaring, and the smell of burnt espresso wafting from a nearby kiosk. Outside, a Boeing 737 sat poised for takeoff, its cabin chilled to 68 degrees, pristine and pressurized, ready to carry 160 souls to New York. But it wouldn't move. Not yet. Because of what was about to happen in row 1, seat C, Jalen Price, 18, stepped onto the plane with the quiet confidence of someone used to being underestimated. He wore a charcoal hoodie, crisp sneakers, and noise-canceling headphones slung around his neck like armor. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was calm but undeniable, like a warning the room hadn't read yet. He found his seat in first class, nodded politely at the flight attendant, and tucked a worn paperback into the seat pocket. He was used to boarding without acknowledgement, used to eyes flickering over him and sliding away. That's what happens when you're young, Black, and don't fit the mold of who's supposed to fly first class. He didn't expect warmth, but he didn't expect the slap. And when it came, fast, loud, the flat sound of skin on skin slicing through the cabin's artificial hush, everything stopped. She told him to move. He made a call. 2 minutes later, the entire flight was grounded, and the woman who struck him realized, far too late. She had just laid hands on the son of the woman who owned the SK. The jet bridge hummed with low, nervous energy as the boarding line crept forward. Suitcases rolled like soft thunder. Passengers shifted impatiently, their conversations clipped and half-heard beneath the sharp bark of boarding calls and the faint hiss of cabin air conditioning. Then he stepped in. Jalen Price, 18, tall but unassuming, moved with a quiet precision that didn't ask for space. It took it. He wore a fitted charcoal hoodie, spotless white Nikes, and jeans that had seen the inside of more conference rooms than classrooms. Around his neck hung a pair of matte black headphones. His eyes, focused but calm, scanned the cabin like someone who'd been taught to look without being seen. First class stretched before him, plush seats, chilled air, faint hints of jasmine from a reed diffuser tucked behind a bulkhead. He barely glanced at it. He didn't need luxury. He needed calm. 1C. He slid into the window-side seat with practiced ease. No hesitation, no performance, just routine. He tucked his backpack under the seat with a quiet thump, placed his phone on the armrest, and exhaled slowly. From his pocket, he drew a slim paperback, Octavia Butler, and flipped to a dog-eared page. The seat creaked beneath him, a subtle reminder of how still he sat. A businessman in 1A peeked over the top of his newspaper, eyebrows twitching, but said nothing. The woman across the aisle, a Chanel scarf knotted at her throat, stole a glance, then quickly busied herself with a glass of complimentary Prosecco. Jalen noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't flinch. He'd been raised for this. Not to fight, to hold, to stay centered when everything else tried to shake you loose. Outside the oval window, LAX shimmered under a 77-degree sun. The plane was nearly full now, luggage slammed into overhead bins. Flight attendants moved like clockwork, efficient, smiling, hollow. But one of them hadn't smiled at all. She was coming. Monica Sanders, mid-40s, razor-sharp features, a uniform so crisp it looked like it could cut glass. Her eyes flicked across the cabin until they landed on him. They narrowed, not in recognition, but in doubt. She paused, cocked her head, took one step closer. Jalen turned the page in his book. Calm, still. But inside something shifted. An instinct, honed over years, whispered that the next 5 minutes were about to decide everything. And for the first time in her career, Monica Sanders was about to make a mistake that wouldn't fly. Monica Sanders stood over seat 1C like she'd discovered a boarding error mid-flight. The corners of her mouth never twitched toward a smile. Her name tag caught the light as she shifted her stance. Left foot forward, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Excuse me," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the ambient cabin noise. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jalen looked up, book still open in his lap. He didn't blink, didn't fumble. "Yes, ma'am." Il SI. Her eyes flicked to the boarding pass in his hand. She didn't take it. Not yet. "May I see that?" she asked like it was a dare. He handed it over calmly. She snatched it, fast, dismissive, glancing down at the printed name. Her gaze shifted back to him, then to the pass, then back again. She tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for a confession that wasn't coming. "This is a first-class seat," she said slowly, lips pressed thin. "I know," he replied, voice steady. A second of silence stretched too long. A man in 1D lowered his phone, pretending to check his texts, but listening. A flight attendant near the galley froze mid-pour with a cup of ginger ale. Monica leaned in slightly. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes." She blinked, surprised. "No family? Business associate?" "Number just me." She stared at him as if daring him to say something wrong. Then her voice hardened. "I think there's been a mistake. This section is reserved for first-class passengers. I need you to move to the back." Jalen's jaw clenched. Still, he didn't raise his voice. "I am a first-class passenger." "You need to move," she snapped. "Now." He didn't budge. "This is my seat." Her hand darted toward the phone resting on his armrest, trying to grab it, maybe take it, maybe just make a point, but in the process, her palm smacked his hand hard enough to echo. A sharp crack of skin against skin. Heads turned. A woman gasped. The man in 1D went still. Jalen blinked, more from shock than pain. That sound, that moment. It rang louder than the engines outside. He stared at her, not angry, not afraid, just stunned. Then he moved. He stood slowly, tucked his phone into his hoodie, picked up his backpack, and walked down the aisle. No words, no drama, just a long, haunted silence that stretched behind him like a shadow. Monica Sanders turned, triumphant, until she saw the expressions. Not support, not admiration. Discomfort. Something had cracked. And even she could feel it. She had just slapped the wrong boy. And the sky was about to answer. The last row of the plane was cramped, the seat cushion stiff, the armrest broken. The tray table jutted out slightly, like it refused to close all the way. But Jalen didn't notice. He sat motionless, spine straight, staring at the safety card as if it held answers to a question no one had asked. The back of the plane was louder, children crying, overhead bins slamming, elbows bumping. But his mind had already gone quiet. A kind of stillness settled in, like the eye of a storm. He slipped his phone from his hoodie pocket. The screen lit up. "To Mom." Message. She slapped my hand, kicked me to the back. No one said a word. He hit send. 2 rows ahead, a teenage girl peeked at him through the gap between seats. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted slightly. She didn't say anything, just stared. Jalen turned toward the window, watching the crew finish pre-flight checks. The jetway was disconnecting, the engines hummed. And then his phone buzzed. Far above the clouds and the noise, in a corner office of a mirrored skyscraper in Century City, Adrian Price, CEO of Vulcan Systems and the majority stakeholder in Sierra Air, read the message in silence. Her assistant didn't see her expression change. No words, no outburst. Just a blink. Then a breath. She picked up her desk phone and pressed a single button. "This is Adrian, Flight 218. Halt departure, Seat 1C. There's been an incident." Back on the tarmac, the captain's radio buzzed with a static-laced alert. He paused mid-checklist, adjusted his headset, and frowned. In the rear galley, flight attendant Avery Brooks looked up from her log sheet as the cabin lights dimmed slightly, then brightened, then dimmed again. In first class, Monica Sanders sipped her coffee with one hand and checked her watch with the other, still basking in her illusion of authority. But something was shifting, something she hadn't felt before on any flight. Jalen's phone vibrated again, from Mom. "The plane won't move until this is addressed. Sit tight. I've already called executive operations. You're not alone." He exhaled softly. Somewhere up front, a whisper started among the crew, a murmur that rippled through the cabin like turbulence. Passengers checked their phones. Some glanced around, puzzled at the delay. But Monica didn't move. Not yet. She still didn't know what she'd set in motion. And Jalen? He leaned back into his seat, tucked the phone under his hand, and stared out at the runway stretching endlessly ahead. This wasn't the end. It was the ignition. The intercom cracked with static, then silence. In the galley, Monica Sanders looked up sharply from her clipboard. Something about the stillness unnerved her. Flights didn't go this quiet unless something had gone terribly wrong, or dangerously right for someone else. Then it came. "Monica Sanders, please report to the cockpit." The words rang out like a courtroom summons. She blinked. Just routine, she told herself. Probably paperwork. Maybe a last-minute manifest update. Still, her hand shook as she set her coffee down. She adjusted her navy blazer, tightened her ponytail, and walked the aisle like nothing was off. But the cabin had changed. Passengers looked up. They knew. Not everything, but enough. Some held their phones low in their laps, screens glowing with news alerts or half-written posts. A toddler stopped fussing. A businessman in 3D crossed his arms and whispered to his seatmate. A woman in 2A pulled out her phone and started recording. The door was already open. Captain Reynolds didn't smile. His face was stone. Behind him, the small monitor above the instrument panel lit up with the face of a woman in a navy suit, hair sharp, voice sharper. "Ms. Sanders," she said, "I'm Elaine Winters, VP of Flight Operations. We've received a directive from Sierra Air Executive Command." Monica stood frozen. There has been a reported incident involving a passenger in seat 1C. That passenger was relocated without proper verification. Physical contact was made. Protocols were ignored. You will now personally escort Mr. Price back to his original seat and issue a public apology in front of the entire cabin. Monica's throat dried. "In front of everyone?" she whispered. "Yes," Captain Reynolds replied, "and when you're done, you'll remain in the cockpit. You will not continue this flight." "But The screen cut her off. "No excuses. You didn't just move a passenger, you moved the son of our principal owner. And now we're grounded. This is a public failure, and it will be corrected publicly." The silence was deafening. She turned around slowly, stepping back into the cabin. The curtain between business and coach hadn't just lifted. It was gone. Passengers watched her like jurors. She spotted him, Jalen sitting in the back row, framed by scratched windows and indifferent overhead lights. Calm. Waiting. His headphones rested around his neck. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Price," she said, voice shaky, "I'd like to escort you back to your seat." He didn't move. Not yet. Let her sit in the discomfort. Let her feel what it meant to be powerless in the spotlight she built herself. And she did. Every step of that aisle back felt like a sentence. The aisle had never felt longer. Monica Sanders walked it with the weight of 1,000 stairs pressing into her back. Her once confident stride had softened to something slower, measured, almost hesitant. Every step echoed the slap she wished she could take back. Every glance from the passengers whispered what no one dared to say aloud. She reached the rear cabin. Jalen Price hadn't moved. He sat exactly where she had forced him. Shoulders relaxed, headphones draped loosely around his neck, eyes watching the sky through a smudged window. He looked untouched by the chaos unraveling around him, but Monica could see it now, the tension in his jaw, the quiet armor behind those calm eyes. "Mr. Price," she began, voice low, forced. "There's been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to first class." He didn't look at her, not at first. The pause stretched. When he finally turned, his gaze held hers, and in that split second, the power dynamic flipped. "A misunderstanding," he repeated. She swallowed hard. "Yes, I misread the situation." "No," Jalen said softly. "You misread me." The air tightened. "You didn't ask anyone else to show their ticket. You didn't question the man in 1A or the woman in 2B. Just me." He stood slowly, no theatrics, just presence. Passengers leaned forward in their seats. A camera phone silently rolled from the next row. "I'll return to my seat," Jalen continued, "not because you asked me to, because it's mine." Monica nodded, eyes down, and turned. The walk back was different now. Every row they passed felt like a verdict. Every passenger sat straighter, some watching him, others avoiding his gaze entirely. The ones who hadn't spoken, who'd stayed silent during the slap, were now witnesses to something larger than a flight delay. When they reached 1C, Jalen sat down without a word. He picked up the same paperback he'd been reading before and flipped to the same page. Calm. Steady. Monica lingered, unsure. "If there's anything else you need," she offered weakly. Jalen didn't look up. "I need people to see," he said. "Not just me." "What happened?" She didn't respond. She couldn't. She turned and disappeared through the curtain. Back in her galley, her hands trembled. And in that quiet cabin, Jalen's silence said more than any headline ever could. He hadn't yelled, he hadn't begged. But he had made the entire plane, an entire company, listen. Without raising his voice once, the door to the jet bridge hissed closed behind Monica Sanders like a judge slamming down the final gavel. Inside the cabin, a stillness settled, but not peace. It was the kind of silence that lingers after something real has torn through a room. Not the silence of ignorance, the silence of awareness. Flight 218 was officially in motion now. The plane rolled slowly away from the gate, but nobody was quite ready to move on. Jalen Price sat in 1C, one leg crossed, hands folded over his book. His phone, silenced, buzzed once on the armrest. Another media outlet, another interview request, another attempt to pull him into the center of the storm he never wanted. Across the aisle, a man in a grey blazer cleared his throat softly. "Son," he said, careful, "I saw what happened. I should have said something. I didn't." Jalen didn't turn. "Why not?" he asked without malice. The man hesitated. "Because I thought it would blow over. I didn't want to make a scene." Jalen glanced at him now, expression unreadable. "She made the scene. You just let it happen." The man looked away, ashamed. Behind them, passengers whispered in low tones. Some stared at their tray tables. Others scrolled through Twitter feeds that were already exploding with clips and hashtags. Flight 218. First class bias. Jalen Price. One tweet read, "He didn't yell. He didn't push back. He didn't need to. Silence was the revolution." In the rear galley, flight attendant Avery Brooks stood with her arms folded, tablet in hand. She scrolled through the crew message system. One new notification flashed in red. Mandatory staff review. Incident Flight 218. Subject, Passenger Displacement and Discrimination Protocol. Training audit and full conduct investigation initiated. Avery tapped Acknowledge and exhaled. Lauren Evans, another crew member, leaned in. "Think she'll be back?" Avery shook her head. "Not after this. Not without a miracle." "She'll probably claim stress," Lauren muttered, "or say she didn't know who he was." Avery looked toward 1C. "That was the problem," she said. "She didn't need to know who he was. She just needed to treat him like he belonged." Up in the cockpit, Captain Reynolds monitored engine levels and airspeed, but his eyes flicked to the crew update system. It wasn't the delay that bothered him, it was the precedent. He'd flown through electrical storms, mechanical failures, even a near bird strike over Denver. But he'd never had a flight held mid-board by direct executive order. Never watched a single teenager bend $1 billion airline without saying a word. That power didn't come from status. It came from clarity. Meanwhile, Jalen leaned his head against the window. Outside, clouds began to thicken as the plane rose above the smog belt of Los Angeles. But inside, his thoughts were sharper than ever. This wasn't over. Not because he wanted revenge, not because he needed validation, but because every empty apology, every misunderstanding excuse, every quick PR response, none of it fixed what really broke. What broke wasn't protocol, it was perception. Someone looked at him and decided he didn't belong. And no one questioned it, until the silence became too loud to ignore. His phone buzzed again, a message from his mother. "Statement draft is ready. You don't have to say a word unless you want to. I'll stand beside you either way." Jalen stared at the screen, then typed back, "Let's talk. But not about me. About every kid who's been told to move quietly to the back. I just happened to have a seat they couldn't ignore." He hit send. Some endings looked like landings. This one was just getting off the ground. The descent was smooth, the kind that most passengers never notice. Flight 218 dipped beneath a ceiling of soft clouds, the skyline of Manhattan beginning to take shape like a promise on the horizon. The intercom crackled. Standard landing procedures, seat backs up, trays locked, electronics stored. But no one was listening to the words. Not really. They were thinking about something else. They were thinking about what they had seen and what they hadn't done. Jalen Price sat motionless in 1C, head leaned lightly against the window, the city reflecting in the curve of the glass. His phone was face down now, silent. No more buzzing, no more requests, no more headlines, just stillness, earned, controlled. Across the cabin, a few passengers sat straighter in their seats, not because of turbulence, but because the weight of the past few hours was beginning to settle on their shoulders. The kind of weight that doesn't come from altitude, but from realization, from guilt, from awakening. Some of them would go home tonight and tell their families about the flight where everything shifted. Others wouldn't mention it at all, but either way, they'd carry it. Because what they saw couldn't be unseen. A young black man had been publicly removed from his rightful seat because of how he looked, because someone decided he didn't fit. And the rest of them, well, they'd looked away. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the slap, not the order to move, not even the humiliation. It was the silence. Silence from the ones who saw, who knew it was wrong, and said nothing. Because silence, when injustice happens, is not neutral. It is an answer. It is a choice. It is consent dressed up as politeness. And that day, their silence had cost them something. Jalen didn't need to scream. He didn't need to fight. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stood in the truth of who he was. And the world had no choice but to adjust. That is the power of quiet dignity. The flight touched down with a whisper of rubber on runway and a slow exhale from the engines. A few passengers clapped out of habit, but the sound felt hollow, like a question that no longer needed asking. The jet slowly taxied toward the gate, and Jalen remained seated, calm, composed. He had told his mother he wouldn't leave until every passenger had deboarded. Not for drama, not for pride, for presence. To remind them he was still here, that he hadn't vanished into the story. He was the story. As the seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers began to shuffle awkwardly into the aisle, there was no rush to leave. One by one, they passed him. Some with nods, others with lowered eyes. A few whispered, "Thank you." Not because he had demanded anything, but because he hadn't. And somehow that had made all the difference. A girl, no older than 10, walked past with her mother. She looked at Jalen with wide, curious eyes. He gave a gentle nod, and she smiled back. Just slightly. Maybe that was where the change started, not with adults trying to cover shame, but with kids learning how not to carry it forward. In the galley, flight attendant Avery Brooks watched from a quiet corner. She had said little that day, but now, as she made eye contact with Jalen one last time, she felt the heaviness of truth between them. "You didn't have to fix it," he'd told her earlier. "You just had to see it." She had, and now she wouldn't unsee it either. Outside on the tarmac, a group of executives and PR handlers waited near the gate, clutching folders and talking into headsets. Cameras had been kept away, per Adrian Price's orders. No spectacle, no spotlight, just accountability. Jalen finally rose, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked down the now empty aisle. The cabin, so tense hours earlier, now felt hollow, like something had been removed. Some illusion, some ignorance, some armor. And what remained was a silence that understood its role in the damage. As he stepped off the plane, his mother stood there waiting, not as a CEO, but as a mother who had taught her son what dignity looked like. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. She reached out, placed a hand on his shoulder, and together they walked through the terminal, past the press, past the security, past the system that had momentarily forgotten who he was, and now remembered. Because in this life, silence is never neutral. It either protects the oppressor or it defends the truth. And on that flight, Jalen Price didn't raise his voice. He raised everyone else's awareness. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He just needed to hold still long enough for the silence to speak louder than anything else on board. If this story moved you, if the quiet strength of Jalen Price reminded you that dignity doesn't always need a microphone, then take a moment before you click away. Because this wasn't just about a flight. It was about every room where someone's presence is questioned before their name is even known. Every moment when silence felt safer than standing up. Every time someone was told, without words, that they didn't belong. But Jalen didn't just reclaim his seat. He reclaimed the narrative, and he did it without raising his voice. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's idea of where you belong, this one's for you. Hit that like button if you believe power can live in stillness. Subscribe to the X Daily Stories channel for more cinematic stories that shake the room, stir the heart, and challenge the silence. Comment below. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment when someone stood up by standing still? New stories drop every day. Stories that don't just entertain, they transform. So stay with us. Your voice matters here. And as Jalen proved, sometimes the world doesn't change when you speak louder. It changes when people finally start listening.